Thanks, Mel. A very warm welcome to all of you who've dialed in today for the launch of this report on racial equality in probation. It's great that so many of you were able to join us. We have fully sold out 2 launch events, so over 400 people have signed up for this event. So great to see such interest in what we have to say on this really important topic. I think I'd just like to start by thanking the 2 lead inspectors on this report, who you'll be hearing from in a minute, Trevor Worsfold and Avtar Singh, and they'll be presenting key findings from the report. And also a big thanks to the consultancy Epic, who led the work around gaining service user views for this report. And they spoke to over 80 service users. And again, you'll be hearing more about that work later on in the presentation from Jamal Khan. So thank you to Jamal and the others involved in all of that. And can I just start by paying, for those of you who work with probation, a massive tribute to all of you for the work you've been doing over the past year in relation to COVID. It's been a very tough time for everyone in the service, and it's been really great to see the way that you've responded to that challenge. But COVID hasn't been the only challenge of the last few years. There is a really significant challenge as well about addressing some of the key findings in this report and making sure that people from all backgrounds are given a proper service by the probation service. And that's what this presentation on our report is all about. We've been looking at the racial equality in probation and the experiences of ethnic minority service users and staff. Just to say a bit more about how we define those groups and the sort of numbers that we're talking about 20% of all people under probation supervision are from an ethnic minority. That's probably about 50,000 people. And in relation to staff, just under 14% of all staff are from an ethnic minority, and that's broadly comparable to the picture in the general population. If you look at particular areas of the country, perhaps as you'd expect, there's a higher proportion of ethnic minority staff in some of the big urban areas. So, for example, if you look at Tower Hamlets and Hackney, which is one of the fieldwork areas we went to, over 50% of staff, of MPS staff there, are from an ethnic minority. About a third of staff in Birmingham are ethnic minority, 22% of staff in Bradford. So significant variation across the country. There isn't any published data on CRC staff, but we've been able to gather some data as we've been around the country. And again, the proportion of ethnic minority staff in CRC areas we're finding is broadly comparable to the general population. So, for example, in London, about 44% of London CRC staff are from an ethnic minority background. Just to move on to the methodology for the study before we get into some of our key findings. We conducted this work in fieldwork in October and November of last year. We looked at 5 different local delivery units across the country, chosen in the main because they had a high ethnic minority population. So we visited virtually, and all this fieldwork was done virtually over MS Teams. We visited Bradford and Calderdale, Liverpool and Sefton, Hackney and Tower Hamlets, Bedfordshire and Birmingham. Across those fieldwork areas, we looked at a sample of 100 cases of Black, Asian and minority ethnic service users, and we interviewed 84 probation officers or PSOs involved in supervising those service users. We also looked at a sample of 51 pre-sentence court reports, and we interviewed a focus group of people who helped draw up those reports. We talked to a large number of staff in focus groups, so we held focus groups with probation officers and managers in each of our fieldwork areas, and we held a separate set of focus groups with Black, Asian and minority ethnic staff. A total of 90 staff were involved in those focus groups in the fieldwork areas as well. We circulated a survey to ethnic minority staff in the 5 areas and invited them to come back to us with their views, and 100 staff did so, which is about a third, we think, of the total number of ethnic minority staff in those areas. And as I mentioned earlier, we asked the consultancy Epic to interview Black, Asian and minority ethnic service users on our behalf, and they were able to speak to over 80 staff, 80 service users. What we try and do is always triangulate all the different bits of evidence that we're getting for us. So, for example, our evidence on what service users think and how well engagement is happening with them comes both from individual case files and from direct interviews with service users. And we were also able to compare the data from our sample of 100 cases with a much bigger data set of over 4,000 cases that we've collected from all of our local inspections over the past couple of years. Just to say, we also spoke to a number of individuals who have national responsibility in relation to equality, both in HMPPS headquarters, and we also spoke to the chair of the RISE staff network, and my thanks to all of those who participated in those interviews. So whistle-stop tour of the methodology, and now on to our findings. And I'm going to hand over to Avtar Singh, who's going to take you through the first part of that presentation. Avtar.
Thank you very much, Justin. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for your time and interest in hearing about our findings from this critical piece of work. I have 3 slides to share with you, and we have divided them up into 3 segments. And as Justin said, 100 staff from a Black, Asian, minority ethnic background completed our survey, and just over half, 51%, actually reported that they did not feel that their leaders had a sufficient understanding of the issues they faced, either in terms of their lived experiences and also in terms of their work in their organizations. We found that 4 in 10 probation practitioners, responsible officers, had been allocated cases which had a hate crime dimension or a racially motivated theme, and many reported that this added to the trauma that they were already having to carry in their life. So a worrying finding there. And we believe that in terms of how these issues can be addressed is that there are huge training gaps, and these are gaps across all grades of staff, from practitioner level to senior leader level. So that is something that needs addressing. We recommend that there needs to be greater consultation with responsible officers before allocations of cases which have a race-related element are allocated. And also, we strongly believe that there is a need for ongoing engagement with ethnic minority staff to address their needs. We will be aware of the events of last year, that a range of issues around discrimination, abuse of power, etc., was outplayed on our screens, and staff from an ethnic minority background are saying to us that they want those conversations to continue. And they're saying the reason why they want those conversations to continue, as cited by one person, was racism hurts and breaks your soul and very existence. A really powerful quote there. Next slide, please. In terms of the whole area of recruitment, development, progression, we found that 6 in 10 individuals felt that equal opportunities in staff recruitment were not applied justly and fairly. And over half of the people who completed the survey did not feel supported to progress in their organisation. And we found that almost 9 in 10, 90% of people did not have a personal development plan, which would be a roadmap for them to progress. And we recommend that processes are established for local recruitment to reflect diversity better, that there are regional progression targets, and that ensure all staff actually do have those plans which will roadmap their development and their progression. A worrying aspect that we found was that there was a mistrust that many individuals told us about, and one quoted, "There is mistrust of us Black people. We are not given access to opportunities." And we'll be aware that the whole issue of trust was raised by David Lammy, and this was something that came up in our inspection. And finally, the last slide, please.
It's been recorded, isn't it?
Okay. And then we turn to complaints and grievances. And again, 55% of the people who completed our survey did not feel safe raising issues of racial discrimination. In fact, we found that out of the 30 people who had raised an issue of racial discrimination, only 2 felt that their concerns had been dealt with adequately. And we recommend that there is an urgent need to review complaint and grievance processes, and also to provide effective training to managers to deal with discrimination. One member of staff said, "Black, Asian, minority ethnic staff do not have a voice. When issues are raised, we are made to feel like we are the problem. Why should we bother? Who's listening to us?" I think there is another slide that is following, Mel. Okay. And staff told us that these were some of the things that they would like to see. They would like to see an improvement in the recruitment and career progression. They'd like to see better representation within senior management and senior leadership. They'd like to see in-person training that effectively focuses on race issues, better handling of racial discrimination grievances, and an improvement in data collection and analysis. And on a positive, one member of staff said, "My workplace has made a private space for me to undertake my prayers and has made considerations on Fridays when I go to the mosque." Thank you. Can I hand over to Trevor now, please?
Next slide, please. Good afternoon. Turning to service delivery to minority ethnic service users, we looked at the vision and strategy for delivering services to this group, the resources available, and what information was available to identify any disproportionate outcomes. Unlike the MOJ strategy for women, there's no current national strategy and approach to working with ethnic minority service users and identifying and addressing any disproportionate outcomes. That's why we are recommending this a real opportunity now to establish such a strategy for service delivery in the NPS. And in part, it may be that because there isn't that focus and staff found it difficult to articulate what the strategy was, maybe one of the reasons why it was disappointing, but we did not find as much effective practice as we were hoping to find in this area. Looking at resources, there are some excellent diversity managers around the place, particularly in the NPS regions. However, there aren't enough people working in this area. We're conscious that resourcing of work on diversity and race equality has reduced since transforming rehabilitation, and certainly in the CRCs where they've been hard pressed, those roles have tended to disappear and be subsumed into other people's job descriptions. So there's not been the same focus, and we've seen some services being lost as well. Looking at information, it's really important that there's public accountability for work with service users and any disproportionate outcomes. But at the moment, nothing like that is currently published. So we're recommending there should be published data on probation, supervision and the outcomes for all service users segmented by race, so that services can be held to account. This also needs to be local information. Probation has a large amounts of data, but the local information needs to be interrogated to identify priorities for intervention. Next slide, please. So, Avtar has already spoken in part about staff training, development and supervision. And there we discovered that only 1/3 of staff felt that there was sufficient training in this area, and it's important that not only that there is the training, but it also needs to be embedded, as part of the gap is explained by one training officer who said there is insufficient focus on race, diversity and anti-discriminatory practice for those staff entering the organisation. Staff tend to obtain information via informal communication channels, colleagues who have personal experience. As I said, training is not enough. It needs to be embedded through supervision by middle managers and practice developers. This doesn't always happen, so we were asked about it. And this comment, this quote that you can see here from one member of staff, was perhaps typical, saying that never had they had discussion of the cultural needs of service users in supervision. The focus tends to be on process, tasks, risk and updating systems. Some were not confident that their SPOs would have the skills or the knowledge to assist them, though this wasn't a universal finding. Next slide, please. So moving to service provision. Only 1/4 of practitioners agreed that there were appropriate services commissioned to meet the identified needs and risks of ethnic minority service users. CRCs had not been required to provide specific services geared to their needs. That wasn't part of their contract. And therefore we saw some services, some really good services which have been delivering mentoring to minority ethnic service users coming out of prison being lost. And that was an award-winning service lost in one area. And that was a real shame. And when we asked about services for racially motivated offending, 9 out of 10 practitioners said that there were insufficient services available to do this work. So we did find some examples of small local community organisations who could provide a culturally appropriate and well-informed service that could improve understanding between individuals and practitioners with different ethnicities. For example, the Shaffer programme in Bradford and Calderdale. There's more services out there like that could be engaged, and so we're encouraging the probation services to work more with these organisations and see how they can be funded to involve service users in looking at what services are available and to engage them in the production maybe of some of those services. So here's a quote which EPIC came across from one particular individual who said that they'd wanted support for their childhood trauma, what they'd experienced, the discrimination and disadvantage they'd experienced, but they'd not been referred to anyone or anything. So there's a real opportunity here to be working with more services in this area. And then moving on to assessment, planning and engagement. As you've heard, we looked at 100 cases and we looked at 51 pre-sentence reports. Analysis of service users' diversity was poor in most cases, with the result that the overall quality of engagement of service users in both planning and assessment requires improvement. And perhaps as a consequence, in more than 2/5 of cases, not enough services were provided for this group. You might say, well, why is this? What's this reluctance? There was a reluctance on the part of many probation practitioners to talk about issues of race, diversity and discrimination. There may be a number of reasons for that. It may be lack of confidence. It may be seeing it's not relevant, but we feel strongly that you need to get to know people and to know their experiences of discrimination, disadvantage, what they may have experienced already upstream in the criminal justice system. But some practitioners clearly did not feel confident. As you can hear, one practitioner said, if I'd asked him about his experience in relation to race and ethnicity, I would not have been equipped or prepared for whatever he would have said. However, there was one really interesting example of a practitioner who'd, following on from the Black Lives Matter process last summer, had decided that, yeah, they were going to talk with their service users and try and find out what their issues were. They didn't feel very confident in doing, but they actually decided, I'm going to do this, despite their nerves. So they asked this particular service user about their experience, and he told them that when he went into shops, every time he had to keep his receipts so that he was afraid about being apprehended every time he went out of the shop. And this was a real revelation for that practitioner. And they told a lot of their colleagues about it, because just through that little bit of learning, they began to understand more what it was like to experience discrimination and disadvantage. I'm now going to pass over to Jamal Khan from Empowering People, Inspiring Change, who conducted the service user interviews.
Thank you, Trevor. Hi, everyone. My name is Jamal, and I've been working with Epic Consultants since the beginning of their research. Here are the key points that we found from our participants. Phrases like BAME are problematic. People assume that just because there's representation from different races of probation staff, they are automatically going to be best equipped to help service users. But one service user expressed that just because he's Asian, everyone assumes that he's going to get along with his probation officer who is also Asian. But what isn't considered is the long history of conflict between his country, Pakistan, and where his probation officer is from, India. He felt that this affected their relationship, and the term BAME doesn't recognize the historical differences in culture. Most have experienced racism in their lives. Service users told us that different ways that they've experienced racism. They said that they've experienced racism from a young age in their community, school, and through stop and search, while others have experienced it in more subtle ways, such as being denied of job positions in workplaces that clearly didn't represent or want to employ people from their race. They were tired of it and didn't see the point in talking about it. For support, most rely on family and friends and faith groups over probation. They express that they are a lot less judgmental and actually have more connections to their local communities who can help in accessing services they need. This was also down to the fact that they felt like they were coming to probation for a conversation or a quick checkup, that they had to do it as a part of their supervision as opposed to some sort of practical support. Probation officers don't know how to begin conversations around ethnicity, race, or culture. Service users said that after their initial conversation, where the probation staff asked them about their race and background, there isn't much talk about it after that. The ones who are not from the same country don't know what else to say about it, or are afraid that they might say something wrong. Matching probation officers by race is not a simple fix. Service users express that there's sometimes a generational gap in understanding that can impact their relationship, like in topics such as mental health. Many elders from African and Asian communities dismiss mental health as a sign that one is lacking in the implication of faith or religion, but the younger generation are more aware of mental health and that everyone is impacted by it. Next slide, please. There's a desire amongst service users to see people from ethnic minority groups at the top. Service users would like to not just see people who have lived experience and who are from the same racial background to be working as probation officers, but to also be in senior positions of probation so that they can make systemic changes and improve probation as a whole. There needs to be a better understanding of individual needs. Rather than having typical forms of support such as back to work programs, the support that's provided needs to be a lot more holistic and cater to individual needs, such as making an effort to connect with community leaders who can mentor and guide service users, supporting service users in accessing mental health provisions, support with confidence building, speech and writing courses, more external facilitators from different career paths who can come into probation and speak to service users so that they can find what is right for them. And finally, to quote one of our participants, there should be a shared commitment to help us more, especially because there are so many barriers built against us in society. Probation doesn't need to be another one. There's a lot more in this report, and you can find more about it on our website, Epic Consultants.